afternoon. We are very excited today to get started with to launch Radio Jaguar. This is a historic podcast, and we have decided to launch our podcast with historic figures that have contributed to the history of Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts. And today we are featuring those that help build and create the historic Mission Gráfica. And with us today, we have two special guests. We have Juan Fuentes and Michelle Mouton. Yeah, woohoo! I got it right. And I want to start off with a little bit of history and context. Mission Gráfica, Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts was established in 1977. And I believe Alfonso Maciel started Mission Gráfica. And later some very renowned printmakers joined Mission Gráfica and were part of this amazing colectivo that created art for the people, posters, political posters, and prints for the community, for different community organizations, for different political movements. And, back then, Mission Gráfica also served as the print shop, the local print shop for the Mission District. Juan Fuentes is very well known. He's one of the most prolific printmakers that we have. And I'd like him to, Michelle, would you like to introduce Juan? No lo quiere introducir.
Because we didn't really organize it.
To do that? Okay. Well, Juan, introduce yourself. Tell us a little bit about who you are and how you came to be, how you became connected to Mission Gráfica. Okay, that sounds great. Let's do that.
I met Michelle at the state, and we've been partners for almost 50 years, I think. But I think Michelle was an activist, has been a political activist, and it was because of Michelle and the other sisters that she worked with that basically I learned about the women's movement and how to act like a real man and treat women with some respect, right? And that came through, Michelle's hard work on me, but also she was part of an organization called the Verbal Women's Alliance that became the Alliance Against Women's Oppression, and it was her years working in that organization and other political organizations that she kind of exposed me to that were on the left at that time, like probably mid-70s or late 70s or 80s, early 80s. It was through the alliance that I was, fortunate enough to be able to produce some of the posters within the women's movement. And so one of the posters that's in the book that I did was a conference that the Alliance took part in, that was in South Africa, in Kenya, That Michelle was part of it, was part of the World Women's Conference. So the poster is in the book. And I got a chance to do a few other posters for the organization, which is kind of unusual because it was a women's organization and I was able to do that work. So and I guess she could fill in whatever else. She's a fantastic person and mother and great cook. I'm gonna let go of that. But I think that one of the things that's been really critical for me in terms of Michelle's how she responds to my work is that she's really sometimes a little too honest about something.
Mhm.
And it's either on target or she's like, no. She said, I'm not quite sure what's happening with it, but I know it's not right.
Mhm.
And also she's quite an artist in her own right.
Mhm.
She's really connected to the art community in the Bay Area and did docents at the museum. So she's very much knowledgeable about art and how to critique art. And she's been exposed to, because of my work and others like myself through the mission and the Mission Cultural Center, Mission Gráfica, she's been exposed to a lot of the cultural work and the posters and all that. So she knows it probably better than I do.
Now, Juan, this question goes to both of you. What were some of the biggest challenges for you as a male during, what was it, the 70s when you guys met? 60s?
Yeah, early 70s.
Early 70s. You know, what were some of the issues that you needed to kind of shift in terms of how you perceived women and how you treated women? What were some of the aha moments for you? Like, oh, I didn't realize I was doing this. And what was it that, Michelle really, what spot did she hit that made you kind of like come into consciousness?
I think that sometimes as men that we're really aware of how we have been brought up in a society that's very male dominated. But also, I'm also Chicano, so my parents, my dad was very much Mexicano, Mexicano, like staunch, tough guy, and I saw it firsthand because I saw I'm from a family of 11 children, and there's 7 boys and four women, right? But I was always very connected to my sisters and my mom. And I kind of saw firsthand their oppression, how they were treated. My sisters went through hell with they married the first guy that they saw because they had to get out of the house. Not even get out of high school. And they were already, married with somebody having kids. So there was a lot of stuff that I saw firsthand in terms of what was going on. With my dad and my mom, there was a relationship. There was a loving relationship there. I mean, they had 11 kids, so they were busy.
They were in love.
But my dad was really demanding, and he was the man of the house. And I had a lot of issues with him because I never fit the mold that he wanted. And I was always getting chased or something was happening. But my dad died fairly young because, I think it was the exposure to DDT. Because when we grew up in the farm labor camps, the men had to stay out in the fields and
Let's start.
spray the fields with DDT. I mean, we know it's DDT. I didn't fit. But my dad had a lot of issues with respiratory problems and breathing right. And my brother, my older brother, was just a year older than me. I mean, he was only 16 or 17. We would drive him from Watsonville to Salinas to the hospital like almost twice a week. And, through the night, we both would go. I would go with him, so we would go back south and take my dad. Sometimes they'd leave my dad there, and sometimes they'd bring him home, right? We could bring him home. Sometimes he'd stay there. But so my dad, he died, and when my dad died, my mother became another person that I didn't know because my mom to me, just seemed like this little old lady that was basically, cooking and cleaning and taking care of a lot of kids. When my dad passed away, it was hard. It was sad. I was in 8th grade when when he passed away. But my mom blossomed into herself.
Well, I think she was going to
She was so impressed. I didn't know. We didn't know.
No, well, you came. Your family. Your dad was a farm worker.
My dad, yeah, they were farmers. I mean, my dad married my mom. I think my mom was like 13 or 14. They never went. They grew up along the border. My family was on the border near Mendoza, which is down by El Paso, that Ojinaga, down in that area. Ojinaga's on the Mexican side. So we had family on both sides. There was no border, so people would go back and forth, right, until they put a border up. That's where they were raised. But in that part of Texas, there were no schools for Mexican kids. They didn't go to school.
Mm-hmm.
My sisters didn't get to school until my parents moved to New Mexico, to Artesia. And then it was in Artesia that basically my sisters got to go to sub school. They got maybe 6th or 7th grade, 8th grade at the most. Then the two youngest ones were able to go to high school in Watsonville, but we had moved to California. Then it was around 1952 or so that my parents moved as farm laborers to California and settled in Monterey County, which I was so glad to move to the valley and Fresno and all that because I grew up in a really beautiful area.
Mm-hmm.
We were like near the labor camps where we grew up were like near Lost Landing. We had access to the beaches. We had, I mean, for me as a young person, as a kid, I didn't understand what was going on with the work in the fields, but we were always in the field working and picking and doing everything. I didn't pick cotton, but I went to the cotton fields with my dad and my brother. They would go to my bakersfield and pick cotton. And I was walking around with the truck that comes like we were doing it. But I mean, I grew up in the fields, but it was that kind of energy with the men, and they ran everything and they controlled everything, and it was the case for my sisters when they got married too. I mean, there was they got married to some men that were super abusive. Mm-hmm. I saw it firsthand because I spent a lot of time because I had issues with my father. I spent time with my older sisters, and I could stay with them. But then I saw the same thing happening with them. So it wasn't a big stretch for me when I come to San Francisco and there is a women's movement, and then I happen to find a partner or person that I was with that basically was part of that movement. Mm-hmm. So it really made me have to take inventory of my own youngness, and I've made a lot of mistakes like we do because of the fact that we're men and we kind of stupid sometimes around certain things,
and we're products of our history. We're also conditioned, and our culture. I love my culture, but there's also within that culture we have culture traps that we're not aware of. And one of the beauties of the political movements of the time that you came up in is that in Latin America, like for example, in Cuba, we had as people became conscious and women stepped into their power and they were part of the revolución. The music of like Pablo Milanés, Silvio Rodriguez talks about male and female being partners and allies, and love was no longer, loving the relationships of love were not just physical, and it wasn't just about making babies and about just living a domestic life. to be in love during the revolution meant to find a common ground and to be able to connect body, mind, and soul, and also politically. Because back then, if you're not politically aligned, there might be an attraction, but that relationship wasn't going to last. And I could totally see, just from, I mean, I don't know you very well, but just from seeing your partnership and the respect and love that you have for each other, that how you each influenced each other and grew not just to love each other as a couple, but also how you influenced and helped each other grow and evolve.
The art had a lot to do with it.
Mm-hmm.
I think for me, the art, it was the actual making of art and the way that people respond to it that, you know, helped me kind of like figure out how I was going to relate to women. And not only that, but I think the hardest thing for me was raising a son and have him not follow the same footsteps that I had already taken, right? And it's been a challenge. But our son has a very different kind of relationship and respect for women that it came out of our struggle together with him, because it's really hard when there's so much derogatory language that's used in the songs that come out and the way young men and the media treats women. And it just kind of gets reinforced again. So we have to keep fighting that thing. Like, we're not going to talk like that. We're not going to say that. We're not going to use that word, whatever it is, right? I mean, because we're constantly fighting against that stuff. But we had to break the mold up.
Yeah, you had to break the cycle. You had to break the cycle. And Michelle, yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad that this part of your story is coming out, because I think it's important to know, you know, that we all grew and evolved, that everyone grows and evolves, and that art is a source of healing. And I want Michelle to talk about how la cultura cura and how art heals and the spiritual aspect of the art.
There was kind of a funny little story about my raising him at 9 or something. He said something to his sister, like shut up or something. And I remember I was telling him, you know, this house is her safe place. And we're not going to have that kind of show. And no, we're not going to have that kind of language here. And he said, I know I'm a chauvinist kid. At 11, I know that he was influenced by the kind of the world around him and what he was seeing. And the women's movement, it was focused primarily on women of color, but it was still, and he also saw his aunts as one saw them. I mean, a lot of them were real beaten down, but they also had a strength. I mean, they had a real strength. I mean, I know that that's part of the culture, is that you hang around with women. And even though my family was small, there were 3, I had 2 sisters. So there were 3 of us, and we were women. But my mother comes from a family of 12, so I had thousands of cousins. Well, I won't say thousands, but a lot of cousins that I was interacting with, because everybody migrated. Most people, except for 2 sisters, a sister and a brother, migrated to San Francisco. So this is where I'm a native San Franciscan. So I mean, I have seen a lot of change in my life. But as far as art healing, my first experience with that really was, I was the youngest member of the Vincent Ramos Brigade that traveled to Cuba when it was still illegal to do so. And I saw art transform the revolution. I mean, work side by side. I mean, I saw art that was just incredible, a high quality art, but representing abstract ideas. People don't often think of political artists doing something really crazy, but you know, you think of freedom. How do you describe freedom? How do you describe apartheid? How do you describe struggle? How do you view all these things that are very abstract concepts that get transformed by art in a palatable way that the people, the public can see it. Well, that was what was happening in Cuba. I remember Juan had a collection of Cuban posters that he showed at the, what was that, Legion of Honor in, what was it, a long time ago. Mid-80s, but for us, it was a long time ago. For some people, it's not that long ago. They were born in the 80s. But I remember seeing this one of the posters really stuck out to me, and it was on water conservation. But it was so superior in the way that it was done, and it was just like a drop of water coming out of a fountain, and there was some slogan on it, but it was so beautiful. And then that, along with the posters that we received and prints we received in Cuba that I didn't take care of, like Juan, from Maderos, like many, many colors, 35 colors in one print, talking about as in Vietnam. I remember that was the comment on one of them. And they're just incredible ways to capture the movement. And so for me, the arts were very important. I mean, they still are to this day, as an arm of the revolution, not as a department where you ask somebody to do something for you. And I also saw that because when Juan first started doing posters for the movement, there was a lot of people at the top who didn't know anything about art telling you it had to have these 5 elements in it. So he made some ugly posters based on that kind of thing, because until you can really see that you're not going to establish yourself as knowing what the themes are and what the important things are, you're kind of wandering around. But then he developed his stamp on political poster making that was like really creative and really exciting and really beautiful. I mean, you could see many of the early posters for International Women's Day that we produced were produced by Juan. Many of the prints that were produced for El Canto Popular, or Encuentro, the Canto Popular, were done by him. And so he would take a theme and basically run with it. At that point, he knew they could trust him to do it, but he kind of cut his teeth on the earlier prints he did. He did some for Baaki, the Baaki anti-Baaki movement. He did some for the ethnic studies thing, and they had good qualities, but his work really developed through the arts, and I think that was the message that really got me going. I mean, that you can do something about something so complex and so deep. Freedom, women's liberation with a poster without saying a damn thing. You could just have it like that, or you could have text on it or whatever. So I feel like art is healing, but it educates. It makes the community more conscious of the ways they can address the things, the struggles that they have around them, and the movement out of that, So I feel like that I had something to do with Juan's consciousness, but I think his sisters and his mother had a lot to do with it, because they came through those struggles. In fact, I think one of his sisters, now 2 of his sisters have passed away, but the others survived some horrific crap, and they bought houses and they did stuff to support their family. So, there's a lot of things in the culture that's nascent, that's a real strength, that I felt was really akin to sitting in the kitchen talking to those women, and they'd laugh at me because I didn't really speak Spanish. I understood it, but I didn't feel comfortable speaking it all the time. So I would hear his mother talking about me. Do these tortillas taste done? And I just turn around to her and say, yes, they are done. And then everybody would laugh because it was like, okay, we can't talk about her in front of her because she understands too much Spanish. So anyway, it's just what the fun and they taught me how to make tamales. They taught me how to make, menudo, all those things that I carry along and pass on to my kids. So, it was a really familiar relationship, because you always got with the women and you laughed and you danced and you
Connect.
And you had the music going, and so that stuff wasn't that unfamiliar to me, and that's why I recognize the parallels between his family and mine. I mean, one thing I did learn is I had a much more privileged child rearing than he did. I mean, I wasn't in the fields. I took piano and viola lessons and art lessons and all this stuff. My parents were working class, but my mother was a real go-getter. Every scholarship she could nail down, I got a hold of. So I had a lot of experiences and a lot of richness, even in terms of the art. I took lessons at the piano when I was like 12 or something. So, but there were things that he learned about my culture as an African American woman, and that I learned about his. We always were in solidarity with each other, but we got a lot deeper understanding of what the plight was of his family. And I think what he understood that we face as African Americans, because you have a son, you better start, and you have daughters, 2 daughters, you better start understanding what those things mean. So we raised each other's consciousness, and I think it was pretty equal in a certain sense. And then he actually continues to expose me to the rich arts that were here in the Bay Area and across the world, really. I mean, I've met artists from all kinds of places. And so that has really brought us together, sustained us, because that's the way he screams. That's the way he curses me out. Or deals with his frustrations there's still many in the society. So that's where the art, and sometimes I'm jealous of that, because I do scream. I do curse. I do, go kind of crazy, because it's a difficult society we live in, and there's mental health is a challenge for all of us.
Can you both tell me a little bit about what years you participate? What was your role? Like, Juan Fuentes, what was your role at Mission Gráfica? We're here because we're promoting, we're trying to raise money to help publish the book that tells the story of these revolutionary printmakers at Mission Gráfica at Mission Cultural Center. And the book is called Mission Gráfica, Reflecting a Community in Print. And there is a Indiegogo Kickstarter where you could pre-order your book for $45, and you're going to get a beautiful copy that has the story of these amazing printmakers and a very beautifully curated selection of prints that were created at Mission Gráfica in the Mission District. And I want you to just go back a little and tell me, Juan, what brought you to Mission Gráfica? What years were you there? What did you do there?
Well, I'd have to step back to my upbringing, because basically I was recruited to come to San Francisco State in 1969, 70, and I ended up at San Francisco State right after, it was the SF State strike was kind of at its closing. There were still police on the campus. We used to go to class and we had to go through lines of police to get to class. I was recruited with a wave of other people of color, basically, that got recruited through the educational opportunity program throughout various schools. But San Francisco State was my choice, and that's how I ended up there. Luckily, one of my friends, close friends in high school, Rick Jaime's parents were some of the organizers that were recruiting kids, and so I got recruited because of him. So I came to San Francisco. I was already coming back and forth to San Francisco because my brother lived here. My brother was a barber, had a shop on Clement Street. My sister-in-law worked downtown in the offices of the secretary or something. But so I would come back and forth, and we were coming anyway because by that time, I had pretty long hair. We were all into the counterculture movement, and so we probably hung out right here on 8th Ashbury. I would come to the concerts and we do all kinds of stuff back over months ago. So I wanted to be in San Francisco. It was at San Francisco State that I basically started taking art classes, totally by accident. I had no art. I had no art background. The high school that I went to was basically the Chicano kids, the Mexican kids, were all like railroaded into all the agricultural classes, wood shop, mechanics. I didn't take an art class in high school, but I did take wood shop. I mean, it served me well, but it was my exposure to the movement at San Francisco State and the social movements that were going on at that time. In particular, the Vietnam War was on, and so we marched against. I started marching against the war, and worked with a guy who did a couple of posters in my house. But I took a class with Chicano artist named Garcia, who's like the premier Chicano artist. And Rupert, I worked with Rupert, and we did, the old style, like hand cut stencils, really toxic stuff. But I learned how to print. And then also with Rupert, I was exposed to or introduced to Malaquias Montoya.
Oh, yeah.
Who had a studio in Berkeley. So I got to go there. Between those two guys, they were already doing the posters. And I started to learn how to silk screen. And it was that was my introduction to printmaking. My degree is in painting and drawing, but I'm a printmaker and I'm known as a printmaker. That's how I'm seen historically as a printmaker. I've taught at the San Francisco Art Institute for a while and at CCA with no degree in printmaking. It was all learned in the streets. I mean, it wasn't like I knew how to design a poster or anything like that. I mean, I learned that because of people like Rupert and Malaquias and my exposure to. I did go to Cuba in 1974, I believe, or 75, and that was a real eye opener for me because artists were actually contributing to a revolution and were part of it and connected to it in a way that I had never seen before, right? So those examples and that kind of work that was being done already in the movement,
you were just part of it.
But also the other thing is that I went to the Mission Cultural Center before Mission Gráfica was there because I worked and I volunteered for like a local newspaper for like 10 years. And we used to do all the paste up, all the layout and all that. And so that was another avenue for me in terms of how I got involved. And then there was a movement print shop called Fitz Printing on Valencia Street, long gone. But I got to know people there, some of the printers. We knew people because they were part of the movement, the left movement, and I was connected to that through Tecolote, through going to Cuba, and it was at Fitz Printing that I learned. I didn't learn how to print. I never printed on a press, but I learned how to do all the pre-press work, and they taught me how to do that there. That was enough for me to get into a professional print shop downtown on Mission Street, Mission and New Montgomery. It was called Garcia Litho, and they trained me some more there, and they trained me how. I was a stripper. I told you I was a stripper, right?
You're a stripper.
But I was strip film. We put film so they could burn plates, right? That's what I was doing for many years. And out of that, I ended up being able to teach that at City College through the Mission campus. So all of this came through because of my connections with the community and the Tecolote newspaper. And the Tecolote was one of the first groups that was up in Mission Gráfica, along with Tintan magazine. All of the poets were there. Alejandro Alejandro Guia, Francisco Alarcón, and all the other poets were all there. They were doing their magazine while we were up there laying out the newspaper like through the night, right? And then they eventually moved to another office, and but I learned a lot of stuff working with them. I learned about the community. I came from Watsonville, so when I got here, I didn't have a community. I didn't have a sense of community until I got to the mission and I got connected with the Mission Cultural Center and La Alegría de la Raza. I also worked a few years at La Raza Silk Center, and I ran there because I did. They started. They were mostly doing screen printing, but then they bought a press. So I was doing the pre-press work for them. So I worked for them for a few years. So it was all kind of connected, right? And Mission Gráfica came about for me because I got there like in 1990. I was connected with the printers there. I knew Renee, I knew Joss. I had worked on several portfolios with them, and mostly men were printing portfolios. But I worked with Renee, and I went up there. One of my friends that I did called Vinny Mandela's was selected for a Biennale in Puerto Rico, and I got to go to Puerto Rico because of that print that got into a book, because a scholar by the name of Shifra Golden, who wrote works about Chicano art and artists from Los Angeles, and she's a professor at UCLA. She was one of the people that helped to organize it, and as a result, I think I was the only and the first time that they invited a Chicano to come to be a part of this exhibit, right? And, so I was honored. Renee Castro was also, and Renee Castro, one of Renee Castro's friends, was also in the Biennale there in San Juan. And he actually got a prize for his friends. It was funny because they only do this Biennale every 2 years, and then a couple of years later, after they get the Biennale, I applied again, but I was denied, access to it because I wasn't Latin American. I was in the U.S. and they don't allow U.S. artists to go there. I mean, it was an eye opener because I went there and I see all of these tremendous art and printmakers from all over Latin America, including the Caribbean. And we're here, we think we're like the center of all this stuff, and we're not. We're like so isolated. Mm-hmm. But I didn't know that until I got there, and then I'm like, whoa, wait a minute. But I couldn't get back in there again because the next time I applied, they said no because you're not
Latinoamericano. And that's the perennial struggle of the Chicano, right? Where ni de aquí ni de allá, you're in the U.S. and then you're not seen as a full.
You're not Mexican.
You're not American. You're not Mexican. As ni de aquí ni de allá. We're Chicano people, and we're a breed unto our own. Yeah. And I'm a very proud Chicana, but that's always a struggle. Where especially when you travel abroad. I know I experienced similar things. I traveled to Cuba. I lived in Europe, and it was always, what are you? Yeah. What are you? And we are who we are.
Well, it was Calixto Robles who was at the Mission Cultural Center, because I had been in and out of the Mission Cultural Center. They printed, in fact, the poster that I did for that Nairobi I designed it, but it was printed at Mission Gráfica with Renee and Joss. They printed that work there. We got them done for the Alliance. So I had that connection already, and then when they closed the center for a while, and then they had no one running the shop, and it was Calixto that basically invited me to come to I went to a meeting because he says, well, we're getting all these people together because we're trying to figure out what's going on with Mission Gráfica. There's nobody up there running it, and the person who had been running it had left, and anyway, it was a lot of turmoil, and I went to a meeting not knowing that I was going to end up running the studio for 10 years. So that's how
you ended up being.
That's how I ended up with it. Because Calixto
pulled you in.
Calixto got me up there, and then I did it. And I actually had left
my teaching position at City College, which paid me like 3 or 4 times more than what I was going to get at the Mission Cultural Center. But Michelle, again, she supported me. She backed me up, and I said, "Look, this is where I want to be. I want to be with the community. I want to be with these artists. I want to print. I want to work there. This is the place for me to be." And so that's what happens. I mean, I leave City College. Also, you know, it was during a time when everything was transitioning. When I was teaching at City College, everything was done by hand. All the layout, all the paste up, everything was done by hand. The typesetting, I used to teach typesetting while I was there. Everything switched to computers. And then they started to train us on like Photoshop and Illustrator, and because that's what we were going to
transition.
That's what we were going to transition to. And at that point, I was like, no. I don't even have a cell phone, so that's where I'm at. But it wasn't for me, because I a lot of the work that I do is like, even though we use the computers, we use a lot of mechanical things to illustrate what we do. I still like to hand cut and hand quality things done by hand, right? And so that's what I ended up doing, basically. Because of that, I decided I'm gonna leave this work, and then another door opened up for me, and that was at Mission Gráfica. And then I went there, and I already knew the history there. I already was part of it, so it wasn't hard for me to.
It was an easy transition.
It was an easy.
And you were there for 10 years at Mission Gráfica.
I was there for 10 years.
But you should talk a little bit about the hallmarks of when you were there. What did you?
Yeah.
Well, you know, one of the things that happened when I got to Mission Gráfica, because we heard Joss Santos talking earlier, when they were there, and they were there in, like, I guess the 80s, mid 80s. By the 90s, by the time I get there in 99, a lot of the left and the social movements that were going on weren't around anymore. So the need for the posters, the way the community was using them at that time, it didn't exist anymore. And a lot of people were doing in-house because they had computers, and they weren't doing anything nearly as prolific or as talented as what we were doing, but it served their purposes, and it was cheap, and they could print out something for their fundraiser or whatever they were doing, or event, and get the word out without having to go and pay us to do it for them at Mission Gráfica. So when I get there, things are very different. The other thing is that when I got to Mission Gráfica, they were still working with oil-based, solvent-based inks, and I took them out. I transitioned it. It took me a little bit of work. I had to struggle with some of the artists that were there because they didn't want to make the transition. I kept putting stuff down in the basement, and somehow it came back up again. So it took a few years, but eventually the inks that I got, the early inks that I was using that were water-based, were not very good quality. And we used them, they were kind of slick, and I learned to work with them. And then I ended up switching to a water-based ink that was a TW Graphics ink that was being used by Self-Help Graphics in Los Angeles. And I had connections with Self-Help Graphics, and we knew those artists and all that. And so I switched over to those inks, and they were more expensive, but they were much better. Because one of the things that I wanted to do is that I wanted to have more youth there. So I ended up changing the component. Instead of us trying to make money and do all this work for jobs that didn't exist, I decided, let's make it more of an educational component. So let's bring in more classes. So I had Alejandra teaching a class in the evenings. Calixto was teaching screen printing for the adults. Michael Roman was teaching textiles, and Michael Roman gave me a lot of flack when I first got there because he was printing upstairs, and he took over big spaces. So I was able to allocate him a space right below us. And at first he was really upset, and then he was really happy because he had his own space. He could lay stuff out, so it worked out. And, you know, we became really, really good friends after that. But at first, artists didn't want to switch, to make that switch. But I already had an experience teaching at CCA with the solvent-based inks that they used there, and they were killing the birds in the.
That's how you noticed.
That's how I figured it out, because we were using this like fiber cloth kind of thing to clean our screens, and we were doing it all outside. And then one day I get there early and I see these little birds going, and they're picking up these things. And then after that I saw some birds that were dead on the ground. And then I said, this ain't right. If they're killing the birds, it's killing us. Mm-hmm. So anyway, I had them switch to water-based there. So when I came to Mission Gráfica, I had already been working with the water-based inks and had already made that switch. So it wasn't hard to do, but it was something that was necessary. And then one of the things that I focused on while I was there, I never taught any adult classes, but I taught youth, and I did a youth class the whole time I was there. I had kids come in and it was free. I had a free class. I had to fight to get it, but I said, these kids have got to have a free class with materials. So they would come, and so that's who I worked with. I worked with the youth, and I did my class, and then I ran the studio and made sure everything was working and functioning, and so that was one of the things that I did. The other things that I also created like 3 portfolios that we did there. One of the portfolios was like paying homage to Leopoldo Mendez, who's one of the founders of the Taller de Gráfica Popular in Mexico. Mm-hmm. And so we did this, and I got about 6 or 7, 8 artists to be a part of that, and we did this portfolio, and it was beautiful. We used to do portfolios with Renee, and then, you know, people would sell the work and raise money and all that. So I did that. The other thing that I did is that I created a portfolio of based off of the women's show, the Solo Mujeres. Mm-hmm. So I said, well, why don't I do a portfolio with just women? So then I ended up doing Nueve Mujeres, so instead of Solo Mujeres, I did Nueve Mujeres, and what I did is I ended up going through the Solo Mujeres exhibit and looking at the works and picking out certain people that I liked their works that weren't printmakers. There was one person that had done some printmaking, but most of the women had never done any printmaking. So that was the challenge. It was like to get them to print something, and we created a really beautiful portfolio because they came and I helped them go through it, and we printed it together and
selected colors.
I did the whole thing, and I printed the stuff, and it came out really nice, and we exhibited it here and there, and it's one of the Susana Aragon's print called Tutuaje is in the is in the book, is in the new book. So it was a way to bring women into the center as well, and then I had so anyway, that's.
Well, I think that's pretty amazing, and I'm very grateful that you focused on not only that you took out the toxic chemicals that the artists were working with, and that you helped us transition into a more healthier, you know, healthier items to work with, but also that you taught the youth, and I think that's really, really important. This art is it's very powerful art. It's accessible to everyone. It's affordable. Mm. It's the people's art. Mm. And I even though we are in the digital world, we are now bringing together, you know, we have youth that are using digital, but it's really great when I see youth come into Mission Gráfica and combine the two. Yeah. And I think it's really important to learn this history and to teach the youth today these techniques that are,
Yeah, because,
I think, extremely useful.
people see us and they see us as like we're these like established artists that did this work. But when I started doing the posters, I learned because I learned from a lot of other artists that were doing the work, and they taught us, and they because of a place like Mission Cultural Center and Mission Gráfica, we had access to go in and learn how to do it. I mean, I'm not a graphic designer. I never went to graphic art school or anything, but I learned like early on with Rupert and Malachias how they incorporated an image and text. Why is it important? I saw that with the Cuban artists especially, because the Cuban artists, the emphasis was always on a message, but with a really strong image. The image was the focal point. The image brought you to want to see the thing and then say, what is it? What is it about? And then it had the text, and it's done in a really, really professional way. And like Joss was saying, that they tried to elevate, because Rene Castro, when he came to Mission Gráfica and he started there, he was a graphic designer from Chile, and he came with those skills. So when we went there to work and do our work, we wanted to do as high quality of work as we possibly could. And also, I just felt like it doesn't matter if it's movement work or if it's a poster for the farm workers or for the women's movement or for the community. And I did, almost 30 years of posters for the Encuentro de Canto Popular, but I wanted to have the highest quality possible for our people. Like, why do they need to get something that's not as high quality as the posters that were coming out of
the TGP, or
well, not even the TGP, but also like we had the example of all the posters for the Bill Graham. Those things are beautiful, and I mean, I couldn't replicate that kind of work, but I could see how important a good image and text was, and how to how to work with that and make that come alive with the work. And it took years. I mean, some of my early posters, you see them and you're like, oh, okay, how did you do that? But it was, but I was learning. We had a chance to learn. That's what's really important.
I think that's the beauty of Mission Gráfica. And it's still like that today. I walk in and I'll see an established artist like Eugene Rodriguez working with, in the same space with a 12-year-old or a 13-year-old that's just learning how to print. And it's very important to have an intergenerational community present in Mission Gráfica and to learn from each other, because that's the best school. You don't go to school, yes, you could pay a lot of money to get a degree in, in printmaking, but what the beauty of Mission Gráfica is that it's a community, grassroots art studio that gives people the opportunity to learn and develop their art and discover the artists within. And for that, I'm very grateful. Now, I want to turn a little bit now to Michelle. Michelle, tell me a little bit about your involvement in Mission Gráfica. I know that we've learned a lot about your lives and your political vision, your artistic expression, and how you came to be. Can you tell me how you came to Mission Gráfica and what was the highlight for you?
Well, really, I mean, during my tenure in different movements and different organizations, we asked for work from artists because they would give us a good price and they were politically conscious. But I learned from also other people who didn't know anything about art, who were in organizations, who would dictate to the artists what they wanted to see. So, and like Juan was saying, it kind of juxtaposes that to being an arm of the revolution versus, people saw artists as basically bourgeois. They were doing stuff that was fun. They weren't really working. So a lot of times it was a struggle even to get paid for your mock-up. Like when they'd talk to you about the organization and you would work to create something, but they wouldn't think that they have to pay you for that work unless you produced a poster. So that was some of the stuff that went down, and then some of the groups that handled it better, that like would look at, they would give you materials, but they wouldn't tell you how to see those materials. And that was the Arab Students League, was one of those organizations who gave you a lot to work with, but they let you do your thing, and because you kind of know. So I kind of learned some of the errors of the left, and really their lack of incorporating this really important arm of any revolution or any group or movement forward, would be to have an actual department that was like, or a group that was a cultural component of your organization. And I also learned that from the Cubans, because they had, and from Juan and I were talking about the Panthers, they had Emory Douglas as the Minister of Culture. I mean, most countries that were revolutionary had something like that, an arm of their revolution. So for me, I learned a lot from being with Juan and not really being more peripheral to the movement, or, being bourgeois, or not really needing money, or, because I was a part of that, and I was a part of, that was his work. So I wanted to, get recognition of the importance of that work. So that's part of the way I came to the Mission Cultural Center. When I'd come with the project, I would engage with the artists that were doing it, talk about some of the themes. Juan would, oftentimes I would talk with him, and he would mock up something that completely captured it. And so you can see in the one that's for the Kenyan non-governmental women's conference, you can see in that it talks about more than women, because I was in an organization that wasn't necessarily identified as feminist. We were more of a humanist organization, but we were organizing women to be leaders in the movement in other pockets. Go out and do your thing and educate these men and raise their consciousness up to what we do. Because even today, I went to this little thing on the Chicano moratorium at Greg's place. What is that called?
East Side
Arts Alliance. And I saw the guys just pontificating about, and then the sisters came up. They were doing all the damn organizing. So they talked about it. And so after they were finished, I went up to them and I told them, now that I'm retired, I could get arrested even. So you guys have really re-inspired me. The work that you're doing needs to be acknowledged, and you need to be put up and held up and in more the light, and appreciated for what you're doing for the organization. And in my organization, when I was in the Third World Women's Alliance, that later became the Alliance Against Women's Oppression, we had childcare. I didn't know of any group that would make it easy for women to be a part of it. They had to send their kids off or send them to the childcare for the organization that they were working with. I mean, I just felt like we were hitting all the marks. So when we worked with the artists, it was really a dialogue, and they would just do what you wanted them to do, but not by you telling them, dictating what elements they needed to represent, but by really talking and giving them materials and discussing what you wanted to see, what would represent your movement. So that's how I first got to know. And then over time, me and Juan and I, whatever the grammatical thing is, have curated shows. And I always, when I do any project, like this project too, I would say there's not enough women in it, or why are you describing that this way or that way? Because I knew that they valued my opinion as a woman of color and as a woman that had participated in all these different movements. So that my contribution was, I practically wrote the women's section, but we did talk about it, and they were from the discussions we had collectively, but we would make adjustments. And, I think my my racial consciousness even came into play in some of the ways that captions are described, and we would talk about it. Well, that, describing something as quaint and that's just kind of paternalistic, and that's strange. So then we talked about that. Yeah, I agree with Michelle. Yeah, you know, Robin, of course, would agree with me, but everybody, everybody would agree. And so we had a lot of struggle and refinement. And I think I felt really strong about their valuing my opinion, both aesthetically and informed about the history of women's struggle. You know, so that's been my contribution. But one thing I wanted to have Juan say a little bit is about the archive, which is the basis for this book, and you're still trying to maintain.
You know, this archive is it's very important. I think that one of our legacies, the legacy of Mission Cultural Center and Mission Gráfica, is the gift that all of these artists have left us, that we now have in an archive that is going to the Bancroft Library, that has already gone to the UC Santa Barbara, that's in the Library of Congress, and that is being documented in this book and other books as well. But I think, you know, this is just the tip of the iceberg. The collective, the historical breadth that this archive holds is really spectacular and powerful. It documents political movements from all of Latin America, Africa. Just it's very powerful, and I'd like you to talk more about the importance of that archive and how we can, you know, and where we're at now and how we're moving forward with it.
Well, when I got there, they had started to archive the work. I mean, they were in files. They were, you know, flat files, a lot of them at Mission Gráfica, but they weren't. But it wasn't organized completely. It wasn't like thorough. It was just like things were just organized and numbered, and you know. But luckily, while I was there, along with Jenny Rodriguez, the previous director, we were able to like secure a grant to archive it, because I started figuring out that we needed to take care of these works. And one of the things that happened while I was there is that I used to go into the basement to get stuff sometimes, and I went down into the basement and I saw all of these posters stacked up in the basement, and they were the posters from the La Raza Silkscreen Center, because the La Raza Silkscreen Center had been incorporated into the Mission Cultural Center at one point, and then they left, but all of their stuff got put in the basement, and we're basically going to get ready to throw them out. And I said no. So I secured a space that was over by the dance classes. There was a room that they just kind of, you know, stored, you know, stuff that was just random stuff that was in there. So I ended up putting all the La Raza Silkscreen Center posters in there, and just, you know, I wrapped them all up and I put them in there, and I got to put a lock and key on the door. But that prompted us to want to archive Mission Gráfica, and then at that point they got enough money, and we were lucky enough to find an archivist. Her name is Gianna Capesci. Anyway, she was a professional archivist, so she came in and she trained Mariana Garibay, which was one of the other women artists that was working there with me, and they trained her to run the archive, and she showed her how. She worked with us for a few months, and she trained her and me in terms of how to set this thing up, right? Well, what happens is that basically she's able to do that as much as we could afford for her to do, because we couldn't afford to pay her for to do the whole thing. So she at least set us up. She's the archivist for the Schultz Peanuts Museum. Now she's over there. That's where she went. But she's the one that started us and got us going, and it was enough to at least get it organized enough that both the archives ended up at SEMA in Santa Barbara.
Right.
Their archive there.
You know, and Marcia Shaw played a big role when she continued the work, also in terms of organizing and getting the funding for it as well. As we move forward with SEMA, it was a lot of work.
It's a lot of work.
But that was the basis for the show at the De Young Museum, which was they had never had a major show but it was in tandem with Cheech.
It was the Cheech Marin show that they had at the De Young, and at that time
It's mostly LA art.
it was mostly paintings and that work. But they approached Mission Gráfica, one of the curators there, approached me because they wanted to have a community-based section to it
in the museum,
and they were going to originally work with La Raza Silk Screen Center and the Royal Chicano Air Force in Sacramento and Mission Gráfica. So they came and I showed them what we had in Mission Gráfica, and it ended up just being Mission Gráfica. So between the curator and myself, we selected, certain pieces for the show, and then we had another component at that show, that exhibit, and it was because of the archive that he was able to go in and we could pull things out and put together a show at the museum.
Yeah, and there's so much work that still has not been seen. Right now, we have all of the Day of the Dead posters on exhibit at KQED, and they'll be on exhibit for a few months. And I'm inviting you and the other printers to curate a show at Mission Cultural Center that will open on Cinco de Mayo, on May 5th. That'll highlight, hopefully, some of the more prominent, archival posters that have not been seen. This archive is still yet to be discovered,
right.
And all of these efforts, the archiving and sale, and to the libraries, as well as this book and all of these exhibits, hopefully this is just the beginning of a lot more work that needs to go into making sure that people have access to this and that we see.
Yeah, I think we could do a really beautiful exhibit, because the book only has about 100 prints in it, and that's a selection of over 1,000. So if we could fill the Mission Cultural Center, we could do those 100 and plus another 200 or 300. So we could have an awesome show there.
I'm so looking forward to it. It's going to be amazing. So with this, is there anything you'd like to share with the public before we conclude? And again, I want to remind everyone that this is an Indiegogo Kickstart campaign, and we will show the QR code where you can go directly, and for $45 you can pre-order this book. The book is already laid out. Or $50. The book is already laid out, and this, your contribution will help the printing of the book. We are looking for support. We are looking for donations, and I encourage all of you who have an interest in history, those of you who are from the Mission District and beyond, to please support this effort of Mission Gráfica, the publication of the book.
And I think also, just the discussion here today it's something that we were trying to talk about, but it'll depend on what we raise to cover our costs and beyond. But I mean, this would be a really good fundraiser to continue to support the archive, the money that is but the archive at Mission Gráfica specifically, so that the stuff could be fully documented, and because it has to be digitized and all this stuff and numbered, and so that's a possibility. We haven't discussed that.
Right. Now we at Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts, we are looking for, if there is an archivist out there that we have interns, volunteers that are trained that would like to come and donate their time to help us archive this. We are looking for archivists. We're looking for funding. If there are grants out there, please let me know. I am a grant writer, and I would love to be able to look for funding to finish archiving. And we also are looking for an appropriate space to store the archive. We need a temperature-controlled room, a safe space to keep to store our archives. And we are looking for all of this. And I urge the public, if there's anybody out there that's listening to this podcast that has connections, please contact me at Mission Cultural Center for Latino Arts. My name is Martina Ayala. I'm the executive director, and you could contact me at martina@missionculturalcenter.org. Any last words before we close?
Just thank you, Martina, for having us, and that we're able to talk about the work that we've done there. And
thank you for sharing
so
your
much.
story, and we'll get ready for the next podcast with Calixto Robles and Art Hazelwood. Thank you.
Thank you.